How was Britain organised for war? So first of all, what would be the challenges of a wartime economy? Now, as this was the first total war, Britain changed during World War I in ways that still have an impact today. For example, the licensing laws which affect our pubs were first introduced during World War I. So what kind of challenges do you think the British economy would face during a total war? Secondly, how would you start to deal with them? Pause the video and consider both questions. So how did the government control the economy? Now, there was a need for a strong level of control due to the fact this was a total war and the government needed to be able to get the economy working towards the war effort. So they got the Parliament to pass the Defence of the Realm Act, or DORA, in August 1914, and this was the first of several acts giving more power to the government of the day. Now, this gave the government the power to bypass Parliament and issue directives, which had the force of law but did not have to be debated in Parliament, effectively giving them a form of dictatorship. They had the power to seize land, to take over industry, and even to censor information. So this is really a power to control the economy, but also to start to take control of people's lives. So the first area where this was felt was in control of industry. Now, the coal industry was immediately taken over in 1914 as it was key to the war effort. Profits for the coal mine owners were fixed, and any extra money they made was given to the government. Miners were not conscripted into the army, and national pay agreements were put in place to set pay at levels from pre-war. Next, the railways were taken over, largely so they could move soldiers and equipment around the country easily. This meant that the railways, which were all owned independently, became part of one overall system for the first time. And just like the coal miners, the railway owners had their profits fixed and pay agreements were put in place. There was also a Ministry of Shipping set up in 1916 to coordinate supplies. As we'll see later, a lot of the supplies in Britain came from abroad, and so it was felt that they needed to control the merchant ships and the docks to make sure the supply was not uninterrupted. This became important in the spring of 1917 when U-boats, German submarines, sank 3.7 million tons of ships. And so the Ministry of Shipping put in place an approach to shipping where the ships went in convoy for protection. Now, a key area for industry was munitions, and in 1915 there was a major munitions crisis. By munitions we mean the supplies for war, particularly ammunition for guns and artillery. So in 1915, the Daily Mail newspaper exposed there was a shortage of shells, bullets and guns on the Western Front. In some places, men were being issued just with 3 rounds a day to try and fight the enemy. The munitions industry at this point could not match the demand for ammunition and other supplies. So the government set up a Ministry of Munitions, set up and run by Lloyd George. Now actually, this was also a cause of the Liberal government of the day falling apart, and introduction of a coalition government with the Conservatives as part of it. Under the Ministry of Munitions, the state took control of 20,000 factories and their employees. They introduced the latest machinery and controlled wages and prices in these factories. However, it wasn't all a big success. There was a range of issues with the workforce, and strikes were common. And one solution to this was they actually began employing women in what were traditionally seen as male industries. But overall, this was seen as a success, and there was no repeat of the 1915 munitions crisis. So the next area to consider is, why did food become a problem during World War I? Now in 1913, Britain imported a great deal of its food from abroad. Imports came from the sea, protected by the British Navy in wartime. However, German U-boats were sinking 1 in 4 British merchant ships, which meant shortages became common across the whole of the country, and food became a major issue. So by April 1917, there were severe shortages, with rising prices and shops closing, often at lunchtime because they had simply run out of food to sell. And this affected morale because the richer people could afford to continue eating, but actually the poorer people were running out of basic foodstuffs. So how did the government react? By this point, Asquith had been replaced by Lloyd George as Prime Minister, and he decided to tackle both the supply and demand for food. He set up committees to turn land into farmland, which created 3 million acres extra, increasing wheat and potato crops substantially by 1918, and so effectively trying to deal with the supply issue. And by 1918, there were an extra 1 million tonnes of wheat and 1.5 million tonnes of potatoes being grown in Britain every year. He also set up a Ministry of Food to subsidise different foodstuffs, and particularly it subsidised the price of bread, setting a fixed price and paying the producers some money to keep the price fixed. And this gave rise to the 9-penny loaf, as that was how much a standard loaf of bread would cost. He also set up local food groups to put in place some voluntary rationing, and actually the royal family led the way by announcing they were going to reduce the amount of bread and flour they would eat. However, this was not fully effective, and actually from 1918 there was compulsory rationing in a range of foodstuffs, mainly sugar, meat, butter, jam and margarine, and actually this rationing continued in some cases for 2 years after the war ended. So a key question was this business as usual? Now, at the beginning of the war, despite the shelling, despite the changes, despite the pressure that people were under, many people were determined to carry on with business as usual throughout the war. Now, this was very good for morale. However, in many ways it was disastrous for supplies and in making sure the British Army was well equipped and supported. If people in industry went on strikes, if people overate, or if they abused alcohol, had wild parties, it could damage the war effort and mean Britain was less productive and so less likely to win the war. So from 1915, Lloyd George started giving public speeches attacking people's attitudes and imploring them to focus on the war. For example, he introduced pub closing times and persuaded the king to give up alcohol as a role model to his people. So in summary, the Defence of the Realm Act was introduced to give the government emergency powers to control the economy and food production. They took over coal, railway and shipping industries as these were vital for the war effort. And a Ministry of Munitions was set up in 1915 to address concerns about the war supplies after the Munitions Crisis. Now, due to the 1917 U-boat crisis, there were less food coming into the country. So to try and resolve this, the government created 3 million extra acres of farmland to create more food. And the Ministry of Food put in place several measures such as subsidising bread, encouraging voluntary and then later introducing compulsory rationing. At the same time, Lloyd George attacked business as usual to make sure people were focused on the war effort. So, a key question is what had changed during World War I? So what are the main changes happening to the way Britain was run at this time? And secondly, how important do you think the role of Lloyd George was in dealing with the wartime economy? Consider both these extension questions as they are key to understanding the impact of controlling the economy and food production in World War I.
This has been a Flip Your History video. More information and more videos are available on TS if you search Flip Your History, or for more information about Flip Learning and my Flip Learning journey, go to Twitter at Flip Your History or my blog flipyourhistory.wordpress.com. Thank you for listening.